The studio lights were brighter than usual that night. Not because the technicians had changed anything, but because tension has a way of sharpening every shadow, every reflection, every breath caught between words. The audience didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness something far more powerful than entertainment. They were about to witness restraint. Dean Martin sat in his chair with a posture that looked almost casual, but it wasn't careless. It was practiced calm. The kind of calm that comes only from a life lived long enough to know that reacting is easy. But responding with dignity takes courage. His hands rested lightly on the armrests, fingers relaxed, as if he were listening to a late-night melody only he could hear. Too many watching from home, he appeared comfortable, maybe even amused. But those who truly understood people could sense that this was a man choosing his silence carefully. Across from him, behind a glossy desk polished to a mirror shine, sat the producer-turned-host. He wore confidence like armor, smiling in a way that suggested control rather than warmth. The audience trusted him. They always did. After all, he was the one with the microphone, the one guiding the conversation, the one who decided when laughter was appropriate and when it was time to move on. Power, after all, often hides behind jokes. The show had started light, as these things always do. A few remarks about music, a nostalgic clip rolled across the screen, applause at the right moments. Dean had smiled, nodded, even chuckled softly once or twice. He had done this 1,000 times before. Interviews, studios, bright lights, carefully rehearsed questions disguised as spontaneity. None of it was new. What was new was the shift. It happened subtly at first. A tone change, barely noticeable unless you were listening closely. The producer leaned back slightly, tilted his head, and said something that made the audience laugh a little louder than necessary. A joke about Dean's laid-back style, harmless on the surface. Dean smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing gently, and let it pass. Then came another comment. This one lingered just a second too long. Something about how Dean always seemed so relaxed, so carefree, as if he didn't take things seriously. The laughter returned, but this time it was uneven. A few claps, a few hesitant chuckles. Dean nodded again, still calm, still composed. Most people would have interrupted by then, corrected the narrative, defended themselves. But Dean didn't. He had learned something long ago, something the producer across from him hadn't yet figured out. You don't correct someone who's still revealing who they are. The producer leaned forward now, sensing momentum. His voice grew sharper, masked by humor. He spoke about discipline, about work ethic, about how success requires intensity, not ease. Each sentence landed like a soft tap, not hard enough to bruise, but persistent enough to leave a mark if repeated. The audience laughed again, though this time it sounded forced, as if they were being guided toward a conclusion they hadn't chosen themselves. Dean Martin didn't move. Inside him, memories stirred not as distractions, but as anchors. Long nights performing when his voice was tired but his promise to the audience wasn't. Years of being underestimated, labeled, dismissed as lucky rather than skilled. He had heard it all before. The lazy singer. The effortless star. The man who smiled too much to be serious. People often confuse ease with weakness. They assume calm means careless. That grace is the absence of effort. Dean knew better. He had lived better. The producer paused, waiting for a reaction. A rebuttal. A defensive laugh. Anything to confirm the image he was painting. The silence stretched, and suddenly the studio felt smaller, tighter. As if the walls themselves were listening, Dean lifted his gaze slowly, meeting the producer's eyes without challenge, without anger. Just clarity. He spoke softly at first, not because he lacked confidence, but because he understood the power of contrast. You know, he said, his voice smooth, unhurried, people often think I don't care much about what I do. A ripple moved through the audience. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't deflection. This was something else, Dean continued, still calm, still steady. I used to worry about correcting them. Used to feel like I had to explain myself. He smiled again, but this time there was something deeper behind it. Experience. Then I realized something. The studio was silent now. No laughter. No applause. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Realize that the people who think ease means emptiness have never had to carry weight quietly. Producer's smile stiffened. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He didn't accuse. He simply spoke truth in a way that left no room for argument. Some of us learned early on that if you let bitterness sit in your chest, it hardens you. And once you're hardened, you can't sing, you can't feel, and you certainly can't give anything real to an audience. He paused, just long enough for the words to settle. I work hard, he added gently. I just don't advertise the strain. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. The audience didn't clap right away. They didn't know how. It wasn't a punchline. It wasn't a dramatic speech. It was something rarer, a moment of recognition. The producer cleared his throat. Shifting in his seat, suddenly aware that the balance of power had changed without a single insult being thrown. He attempted a laugh, a quick pivot back to humor, but it fell flat. The room had already moved on. What no one could see was how many people in that audience felt something loosen inside them. The single mother who had been told she made life look too easy. The young man who stayed quiet because he didn't want to be mistaken for weak. The older woman who had endured loss with grace and been accused of not feeling deeply enough. Dean Martin hadn't just defended himself. He had spoken for them. The producer tried to regain control, asking another question, steering the conversation toward safer ground, but something fundamental had shifted. The studio no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the truth that had just been spoken. Dean answered politely, briefly, never pressing his advantage. That was the final lesson of the night. Strength doesn't need to dominate the room. It only needs to be present as the show moved toward a commercial break. The applause came not loud, not explosive, but sincere. The kind of applause that comes from respect rather than instruction. Dean nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, then leaned back again, hands resting calmly where they had been all along. From the outside, it looked like nothing dramatic had happened. No shouting. No confrontation. No scandal. But inside that studio, something had frozen in place. Not fear. Not embarrassment, but awareness. And awareness, once awakened, has a way of changing people long after the lights go out. The applause from the studio still echoed faintly in Dean Martin's ears, long after the cameras cut to commercial. It wasn't the kind of applause that fed the ego. It was the kind that lingered uncomfortably, the kind that forced reflection. As he sat alone in the dim quiet of the backstage dressing room, the soft hum of fluorescent lights above him replacing the roar of the audience. Dean loosened his tie slowly, deliberately, as if rushing might disturb something fragile inside him. The mirror in front of him reflected a familiar face, smiling lines. Steady eyes, but beneath that surface, lived memories no audience had ever clapped for. Memories that explained why his calm was never accidental. People often thought his composure was effortless. A gift he had been born with, as if serenity were something that simply settled on his shoulders one day and never left. They didn't see the years that had trained that stillness. Years where reacting would have been easier, louder, and far more destructive. Dean had learned restraint the hard way, through moments when words could have saved him. But silence saved him more. Long before television studios and velvet curtains, there had been nights when he questioned whether his voice even mattered. Nights when the applause didn't come, when the rooms were small and the crowds smaller, when rejection wasn't delivered with humor, but with indifference. Back then, no one mocked him on live television. They did something worse. They ignored him. And indifference, he learned early, could carve deeper wounds than ridicule ever could. Those early years had taught him something vital. The world doesn't always announce when it's testing you. Sometimes it simply watches to see whether you'll break quietly. Dean remembered one night in particular, a night that never made it into interviews or biographies, because it lacked drama on the surface. It was a modest venue, barely half full. It's a kind of place where the audience talked through performances and clinked glasses louder than they listened. Halfway through his set, a man near the front laughed, not at a joke, but at the song itself. It wasn't cruel laughter, just dismissive, careless. Dean could have stopped, could have snapped back, could have let irritation tighten his voice. Instead, he sang on, letting the melody carry what his pride could not. That was the night he realized something profound. The man laughing wasn't his enemy. The moment was, and moments, unlike people. Past that understanding followed him into every room he ever entered after that, including the studio he had just left. The producer's remarks hadn't surprised him. They had confirmed something Dean already knew. Some people confuse control with superiority, volume with authority, and wit with wisdom. The producer hadn't intended to expose himself. He simply hadn't expected Dean to remain unmoved. What made the moment powerful wasn't the reply itself, the discipline behind it. Dean hadn't spoken to win. He had spoken to settle something within himself. And that distinction mattered more than anyone watching could fully understand. Backstage, young assistant knocked gently on the door, poking his head in with hesitant admiration. He praised Dean's composure, his perfect timing, his brilliant comeback. Dean thanked him kindly, but once the door closed, the word comeback lingered uncomfortably in the air. It wasn't a comeback. It was a continuation. Dean had spent his life refusing to become hardened by misunderstanding. He had seen what bitterness did to people who let it fester unchecked. It made them loud, sharp, desperate to be acknowledged. He had chosen a different path not because it was easier, but because it was sustainable. What the audience never saw was that moments like that interview demanded more strength than any performance ever had. Singing required voice. Calm required character. Elsewhere in the building, the producer sat alone too, though his silence felt heavier, restless. He replayed the exchange in his mind, searching for where he had lost control. He told himself Dean's response had been clever, rehearsed, calculated. That explanation made it easier to swallow. What unsettled him wasn't the words it was the restraint. The realization that power could exist without confrontation unsettled him deeply. That night, clips of the interview would circulate quietly, not as scandal, but as something more dangerous to ego, a lesson. Viewers would comment not on what Dean had said, but on how he had said it. Calm, respectful, unshaken. The very qualities people spent. Their lives chasing once noise stopped working. Dean knew this pattern well. The world celebrated reactions but remembered responses as he left the studio. Stepping into the cool night air, he felt no triumph, only clarity. He had protected something that mattered to him, not his reputation, not his image, but his inner stillness. He understood now more than ever that dignity wasn't about winning moments. It was about surviving them intact. The irony was that the producer would go on to tell the story differently in private, framing it as banter gone wrong, a misread joke, an overreaction by sensitive viewers. Dean never corrected the narrative. He had learned that truth didn't always need defending. Sometimes it only needed time, because time has a way of revealing contrasts. Loud confidence fades, quiet strength compounds, and somewhere between applause and silence, between insult and restraint, Dean Martin had once again chosen the path that required the most courage, remaining himself when the world expected him to perform. What no one realized, not yet, was that this moment would ripple outward in ways no camera could capture, touching lives far removed from studio lights, people who would never meet Dean but would remember how he stood still when provoked, how he answered without attacking, how he proved that calm is not the absence of power, but its highest form, and this was only the beginning. The night after the broadcast did not bring rest. Dean Martin lay awake in a quiet hotel room where the city lights bled faintly through heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the walls like unfinished thoughts. Silence, the very thing he had mastered in public, felt heavier in private. It pressed against him not as peace, but as memory, because calm, when stripped of witnesses, is a way of demanding honesty. The world believed his composure was natural, even effortless, but Dean knew better. Calm was not something he possessed. It was something he maintained, and maintenance, especially of the soul, was exhausting. Every time he chose restraint over reaction, he paid a price no one applauded. Every time he smiled instead of defended himself, Something inside him tightened just a little more. Not into bitterness, but into resolve. He rose from the bed and poured himself a glass of water. Hands steady, movements precise. Discipline had long replaced impulse in his life. He stood near the window, looking down at the restless streets below, and thought about how many people were walking around with storms behind their smiles. Storms no one ever asked about because the smile did its job too well. The interview replayed in fragments, not as regret, but as awareness. The producer's tone, the laughter that followed, the silence that fell when Dean spoke. He realized then that the most dangerous moments in life were not when you were attacked, but when you were underestimated. Underestimation invited carelessness. Carelessness revealed character. What unsettled him most was not what had been said on air, but how familiar it felt. He had stood in that position before, metaphorically if not physically, watched by people waiting for him to stumble, to lose his temper, to become the caricature they had already drawn. Over the years, he had learned that dignity was not passive. It was active restraint, renewed again and again, often at great personal cost. The next morning, messages flooded in. Praise from strangers, quiet admiration from peers, even a carefully worded note from the network, congratulating him on a memorable moment. Dean read them all with polite detachment. Praise, like criticism, was fleeting. Neither could be allowed to settle too deeply. He had learned that accepting too much applause could be just as dangerous as absorbing too much insult. But one message stopped him. It wasn't from a celebrity, or producer, or anyone with influence. It was from someone who had no reason to impress him. A brief letter forwarded through his manager, written in uneven handwriting, scanned and attached without fanfare. It came from a man who worked nights at a factory, someone who admitted he had never cared much about entertainment. He wrote that he had watched the interview after a long shift, tired and irritable, already convinced the world was against him. He wrote that when Dean stayed calm, when he refused to strike back, something in him broke open, not weakness, but relief. The letter ended simply, "I didn't know you could be strong without being loud. I'm going to try it tomorrow." Dean sat with that sentence for a long time. That was the danger of restraint. It made you responsible for more than yourself. Once people saw another way to carry pain, another way to hold power, they began to expect it not just from you, but from themselves. And that expectation carried weight. Later that week, Dean was invited to another appearance. Different show, different host, same lights, same audience hunger. This time, the invitation was polite, almost deferential. Word had traveled faster than anyone expected. Calm had become currency. The irony was not lost on him, but beneath the courtesy, Dean sensed something else, a test. Not overt, not cruel, but strategic. People wanted to see if the calm was real or situational, whether it would hold under different pressure, whether the silence could survive when provocation came. Wrapped in concern instead of mockery, he accepted the invitation anyway, not because he wanted to prove anything, but because he understood something vital. Avoiding tests does not preserve strength. It delays its exposure. As the day approached, doubt crept in quietly, the way it always does when stakes are invisible. What if he stayed calm and it was misunderstood as agreement? What if silence was taken as surrender? What if this time, restraint cost him something tangible: opportunity, respect, relevance? These were not fears he shared. They were the private tax of public grace. On the night of the show, Dean sat once again under studio lights, the audience buzzing with anticipation. The host spoke warmly, respectfully, almost too carefully. The questions were thoughtful, reflective. But halfway through, the tone shifted not into mockery, but into something more dangerous: moral framing. Questions about responsibility, about influence, about whether staying silent in the face of disrespect sent the wrong message. This was not an attack. It was an invitation to justify himself. Dean felt the familiar tightening in his chest. This was harder than insult. Insults could be dismissed. Expectations demanded explanation. An explanation, if handled poorly, could unravel everything he had built. He paused longer this time. long enough for the audience to feel it, long enough for the cameras to linger, and then he spoke not defensively, not triumphantly, but honestly. He said that calm was not avoidance, that silence was not permission, that restraint did not mean absence of boundaries. He explained that there were moments when raising your voice was necessary. Those moments lost their power when everything became noise. He spoke of choosing carefully when to speak, not because he was afraid, but because words mattered too much to waste. The studio leaned in, not because he was famous, but because he was clear. He ended with something that unsettled even him as he said it aloud. He admitted that calm often came with loneliness, that choosing dignity meant standing alone sometimes, misunderstood by both critics and admirers, that the smile people loved was not armor, but a commitment, a promise to himself not to become the very thing that once hurt him. The silence that followed was different from before. It was heavier, reverent, not frozen, but transformed in that moment. Dean understood the full weight of what he had chosen long ago. Calm was not the absence of conflict. It was the decision to carry it without spilling it onto others, and the world watching quietly began to realize something too. This wasn't a performance, it was a philosophy. And philosophies, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen. The night that finally defined everything did not arrive with warning. It did not announce itself through headlines or applause. Nor did it resemble the dramatic confrontations people expected when stories reached their end. Instead, it arrived quietly, the way the most permanent moments always do. Disguised as just another appearance, just another chair beneath the lights, just another room filled with people who believed they understood power because they had witnessed it so often on display. Dean Martin sensed it the moment he walked into the studio. Not tension exactly, but anticipation sharpened into something almost fragile. As if everyone present understood that this was no longer about entertainment. The air itself felt deliberate. Conversations hushed more quickly than usual. Technicians moved with extra care. Even the host, a seasoned professional known for confidence, carried a restraint in his posture that suggested respect mixed with uncertainty. Dean had become something unpredictable. And unpredictability unsettles people who rely on control. He took his seat without ceremony, his expression calm but alert, fully aware that every stillness now carried meaning. The audience was larger than before, not just in number, but in attention. These were not people waiting to be amused. These were people waiting to be shown something true. The conversation began gently, reflective, almost reverent. The host spoke about influence, about moments that resonate beyond the broadcast, but how certain responses seem to linger in the public consciousness long after the cameras stop rolling. Dean listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, never rushing the exchange. He understood something the host was only beginning to articulate. When a person refuses to react the way the world expects, the world grows curious. Curiosity, when left unsatisfied, becomes pressure. The pressure came disguised as a question that sounded reasonable enough. The host leaned forward slightly and asked whether Dean ever regretted not responding more forcefully in moments when he was clearly disrespected. Whether there were times he wished he had defended himself more aggressively, spoken louder, drawn firmer lines for the world to see. It was the kind of question that invited justification. The kind that tempted explanation into becoming apology. Dean did not answer. Immediately, the pause stretched longer than any before it. Long enough for the audience to feel discomfort ripple through the room? This was not silence born of uncertainty. It was the silence of someone choosing carefully which truth deserved to exist in public. Dean knew that what he said next would not be replayed simply as a quote. It would be absorbed as a standard. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, neither soft nor forceful, but grounded in something deeper than tone. He said that there were many times he had wanted to respond differently, times when restraint felt like swallowing fire, times when silence hurt more than speaking ever could. He admitted that calm was not painless, that it demanded sacrifice, that it often meant being misunderstood by those who believed strength had to look like dominance. But then he said something that shifted the room entirely. He said that regret only comes when you betray who you are, not when you protect it. The audience did not react immediately. The words settled slowly, like weight finding its balance. Dean continued, explaining that loud responses might win moments, but quiet consistency builds something far more enduring. He spoke about watching people burn bridges in the name of being right, only to find themselves standing alone later, surrounded by the ashes of temporary victories. He said that choosing calm was not about being passive, but about refusing to let another person decide the shape of your character. The host attempted to interject. Not to challenge, but to clarify, asking whether that philosophy ever felt limiting. Whether it ever closed doors that force might have opened? Dean smiled faintly then, not with amusement, but with recognition. He said that force opens doors quickly, but it rarely keeps them open. He said that dignity moves slower, but it builds rooms people want to stay in. Something shifted visibly in the audience. Faces softened. Postures changed. This was no longer a performance. It was a reckoning. Dean went on to say that the most powerful lesson he had learned was this: the world will test you not by attacking your weaknesses, but by tempting you to abandon your values when doing so feels justified. He explained that restraint was not about avoiding conflict, but about choosing which conflicts deserved a piece of your soul. Some battles, he said, are won by not stepping onto the field at all. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the cameras seemed reluctant to move. In that stillness, Dean realized something profound. He was no longer speaking to the host, or even to the audience in the room. He was speaking to every person who had ever been told they were too quiet, too gentle, too composed to survive a loud world. He was offering proof that strength does not always announce itself, that sometimes it simply endures until endurance itself becomes undeniable. When the show ended, there was applause, but it was restrained, almost reverent. As if clapping too loudly might fracture the moment, Dean stood, thanked the host, acknowledged the audience with a nod, and walked off stage without ceremony. There was no victory pose, no lingering smile for the cameras. He did not need one. In the days that followed, people would talk about that episode differently than any before it. Not with excitement, but with reflection. Viewers wrote that they felt calmer after watching, that they handled arguments differently, that they chose silence where they once would have chosen anger, not because they were afraid, but because they were strong enough not to need noise to feel seen. Dean never addressed the impact publicly. He returned to his life, his routines, his music, his quiet discipline. But something had changed irrevocably. Without trying to, without intending to, he had redefined what power looked like in a world addicted to reaction, and that became his legacy. Not the smile, not the songs, not even the fame, but the example he left behind. The example of a man who stood unmoved in rooms designed to provoke him, who answered pressure with presence, who proved that dignity, once chosen consistently, becomes louder than any insult ever could. Long after the lights faded, long after the clips stopped circulating, long after people forgot the questions that were asked, they remembered the stillness. They remembered the way the room froze, not in fear, but in understanding. And somewhere, quietly, people began choosing calm, not as surrender, but as strength.